listening to Hair Raising Horror Week from the Paranormal Patio Podcast.
Welcome back to Paranormal Patio. As always, I am Jason. This is Hair Raising Horror Week, and if you're just tuning in, we've got some great guests lined up for the week. Tonight's guest, Jason Gowin. You might have seen Jason on Hellier Season 2, the infamous alien abduction hypnosis experiment conducted by former guest Lonnie Scott, host of Weird Web Radio. And we're going to get into some information that's been handed down from the source of George Lutz to Jason, as he's become a steward of the Amityville horror case chosen by George Lutz, and his stories are incredible. So without further ado, let's get right into it.
Jason, welcome to Paranormal Patio.
Hey man, thanks for having me.
We're really excited to hear your tales from the Amityville horror case.
It's something that's deeply ingrained in my life for sure, and has been since like 2003. So it's been kind of it's been a long time that I've had ties to the case, and it continues to show up from time to time in my current life, even though I have kind of stepped away from the paranormal to some extent because it terrifies my wife. We have twin 18-month-old sons who are we've had some stuff happen here that she has made it clear that me delving into paranormal stuff is not really her favorite thing for me to be doing right now.
Well, hopefully we don't put you into the doghouse tonight.
Oh, I'm sure I'll find my way there no matter what we do.
I can relate. Well, before we get into talking about the actual case, you let everybody in on how you come to be tied to it.
Well, so I used to be part of a ghost hunting group, Ghost Hunters Incorporated. We shot a documentary with a film crew out of Seattle called Bluegill Pictures. And during the course of that, we had did an investigation on film that turned violent, and then we continued to. I mean, we were just kids. We were just. I was just out of high school. The rest of them were, like seniors in high school, and we taunted. I mean, for lack of a better term, we taunted, and it shoved me violently into a wall. And so at that point, I was done, like, dealing with the paranormal. I didn't want anything else to do with it. But I had agreed, to promote the documentary, when it came out. So we went to the horrifying horror convention in Maryland, and George Lutz, who was the basis for the Amityville horror, his family, was there. And I happened to walk past their booth. He had just been 30 years since he had, been out talking about the case. He had kind of, just due to all the stress that caused his family, he had kind of stepped away from talking about it for, 3 decades. And he was there. I knew of the case. I never had, done much research on it. I didn't know anything about it. But I kind of, obviously I was very interested in the paranormal, even though I had kicked my butt recently. And I walked past his table, and I was looking at some of the stuff he had out. And I said, so you're George Lutz, huh? And he said, yep. And he's like, and who are you? And so I told him why I was there. And I said, yeah, but I'm done investigating the paranormal. And I told him the story about what happened to me. He's like, that's it. So that's it, huh? You're just going to hang it up and you quit. And I said, did you hear the part where I was thrown into a wall? Yes, absolutely. So he laughed, and he's like, you seem like you got this gift for humor. That's something that you could be using against this stuff. I'm like, yeah, but I don't have any idea how to do that. And he said, I could teach you. And so he, at that moment, for whatever reason that day, took me under his wing. He and I, talked on the phone all the time. I traveled with them. He used to do public speaking events towards the end, and he would do cases while we were traveling for them. So, and then he did a lot of different filmings and stuff as well. Mm-hmm. So we I went with him and learned all this stuff, and he became like a mentor to me. And when he passed away, he had left me all his, pictures from inside the house, as well as very direct orders that he's like, look, this case has, done horrible things to my life, and people have left. I'm going to end up leaving this world with people having told me that, this was a hoax, that I was never vindicated. And what I want you to do when I'm gone is continue to tell that story and help get the truth about what happened out there and my story. So that was what I was charged to do. And I have, gone to the best of my ability. I've done, talked about it at paranormal conventions. I've helped people with cases that were very similar in nature. I've done college lectures. I've done the best I can. I was, done tons of interviews about it across the board, from Coast to Coast AM to a little mom and pop podcast. So I have done the best I could with what he told me to do.
That's really cool. How old was he then when you met him?
He was in his early 60s, I believe.
And how old was he when the events took place? Because
he was in his late 20s, early 30s.
Yeah, that math checks out, I think. Well, let's just get right into it. I mean, the family finds the house at a price that seems too good to be true, right?
Yeah, he never really talked about, those specifics with me. That was more, to me, he spent more of the time talking about the actual events that took place in the house, and more so the stuff that happened after the house. Because, everybody, because of the movies and books, people think that Amityville just wrapped up after that time they fled the house, and that was the end of it. And, they never intended to leave the house forever. They left then because it got really bad. Their plan was to fix it up and, get this problem fixed, this paranormal issue, and move back in. They weren't even in the house that long.
Right.
And then there are all these rumors, they got behind on their mortgage. But if you look at how long that they were in the house, they weren't there long enough to have gotten behind on a mortgage.
Fair enough.
So, there's a lot of people who, it became trendy at the time, the late 70s, early 80s, it became trendy to trash Amityville. Even people who, there are photographs of them in the house doing investigations who said, we were never in the house. And there are photos of them in it. Like, that happened. And, the DeFeo's lawyer, he helped because he realized that, Ronnie DeFeo Jr. was not going to get any money from the Amityville horror story. So, he did whatever he could to discredit this at the time, and now he's since changed his story like 6 times. So,
wow.
It became trendy to disassociate with Amityville. So George, took the brunt of this stuff. And the movies, there were lawsuits over the movies and how he was portrayed. He absolutely detested the one without Ryan Reynolds. So, he absolutely hated that movie. And
really?
Hated it. Absolutely hated it. After he saw it, he told us the story that he went to the ticket counter after asking for his money back. And he's like, you didn't like the movie, sir? And he's like, well, it's the worst movie I've ever been in.
Wow.
And so they're like, what do you mean? And he showed him his driver's license that he was the actual George Lutz. And so they're like, we normally don't do this, but we'll give you your money back this time because it's actually your life story.
Man, to be that ticket guy, that's a story he gets to have now too.
Yeah. You can imagine. So, he made fun of the Ryan Reynolds version, like he made parodies of it all the time. Like he never chased his family around with an axe, but like at Walmart you'd find him like walking around with an axe with us. Like, dude, that's just funny stuff that he would do. And he was just, they always portray him that like when the oppression, the demonic oppression started, that he like was this monster.
Right.
And he was, this violent and, just belligerent man. And that's not the guy I knew. Like I knew him, 30 years after this happened. So to me, he was a surrogate father figure. And so I got to see this, he was constantly pranking me. We were at a hotel in North Carolina, and I was in the hotel room directly across the hall from him, and I had told them that I was going to go get something to eat, and then I was going to come back and get a shower and take a nap. And so they knew I wasn't in the room for a half hour, and they had a key to my room because that's where they kept all the video equipment. And they came in while I was gone. And so I was taking a shower, and all of a sudden I heard, "Ow," and I stopped dead in my tracks. I was like, what the? And I like looked around. I'm like, no, you're imagining it. That didn't happen. And so I went back to business, and then I hear, I'm like, okay, I know for sure I heard it that time. And I am not diving here naked in the shower. That is not going to happen.
Right.
And I went to the shower. I was like, I'm done. I'm out. And I heard the get out one more time, but then at the end I heard, boop, and I'm like, wait a minute. So I looked, and underneath the sink, they had duct taped a walkie-talkie, and they were in the hotel room across and doing this get out business. I mean, that's the kind of stuff he did to me all the time.
Wow, that's terrific.
He convinced an entire book signing of people that I was the actor who played Pugsley Addams in the original Addams film. Like these people that keep coming up to me asking for my autograph, because we had gone to a Hooters. Guy loved Hooters. It was like his favorite place in the whole world. And so we went, and like these young, like 20-something girls are like fawning over this guy. And I was like, you are a creepy old man. Why are they talking to you and not me? I'm a young buck here. And then he's like, I'm like, I want to be famous. I want this happy. He's like, you want to be famous? I'll take care of that. And so he told people that I was the kid who played Pugsley Addams in the Addams Family, and people kept coming up and asking for my autograph until I finally figured out why they were asking for my autograph.
Well, he sounded terrific.
His stepsons, that's not how they portray me. Christopher Lutz is a good friend of mine, Christopher Corentino. He's a good friend. And, he and I have talked at length about the difference between the guy he knew and the guy I knew. And Christopher said it best. He's like, you knew him years after this stuff set in. And so he's like, I'm thrilled to hear that he changed as a person, but that's not the guy I knew. So, he was a very funny, very caring guy. He went out of his way to do stuff for me, that he didn't have to do. I mean, he never had to pay any attention to me at all. I was just some kid. And he taught me so much stuff about the paranormal and just life in general. Like he just, really went out of his way to make me feel and appreciated and cared for. And like I said, he was a surrogate father figure for me.
Do you think that he felt like he was like paying a penance for maybe how he had been in the past?
I've thought about that, and I think that, yes, I do think that there is to some extent that, Christopher and Danny didn't want anything to do with him, and so I think maybe it was kind of in some ways his way of atoning for maybe some of, who he was back then.
Yeah.
It's interesting because the last thing he said to me before he died, and on the phone, he said, Jason, you were all, well, he actually called me Fireplug because I was at the time I was like 80 pounds heavier. I was built like a fire hydrant. So he would call me Fireplug. And he's like, Fireplug, you for the rest of your life are always going to wonder who I really was. I love you. And that was it. And that was literally the last guy I ever said.
Wow.
He passed away like a week later.
Wow. Well, all this is really fun and humorous and lighthearted, but we know that the story is anything but.
Yes.
So let's just start from the very beginning. They move into the house. How long is it before they start noticing something's up?
I mean, it started very small, the first, few days, like the, things, extra flies in a room, like they would get rid of the flies and they would come back in. There were a ton more flies. These little drops of like black ooze and like a oilish substance. Like, that's what he said. It was like a black tar oil that was coming out of like little keyholes, or they would find it on the carpeting. And it started very small like that. But I know that like when they started, they had a boathouse behind the house, and he would wake up in the middle of the night and hear that the door was like banging, and he would go out and he would shut it, and then he would go back to bed, and then he would hear it again. And he was blaming the kids for going out and doing this, and they would tell him he didn't do it. Then one time he locked it, and he came out later and it was unlocked, and he was the only one who had the key. So it just started to build from there. And then, their daughter Jody, or their daughter, Missy, started to report that she had this, imaginary friend named Jody, who was a little boy who was in the house, and sometimes he would appear to her as a pig. And, so, it started escalating. He started feeling like he could never get warm. He was always cold. He was, there was a room that Kathy he was at work one day, found a weird room that wasn't listed in the schematics to the house, the original blueprints. In the original, 1970 movie, it was the red room. And, it wasn't there. Weird smells would come out of it. Dog Harry wouldn't go anywhere near it. He was panicked. And that's not that anything, happened in there per se. In the movie they make it seem like that was the gateway to hell. Uh-huh. But in real life, it kind of, other than the dog, like the weird smells and the dog not wanting to go in there, it was not, not a huge deal. It was just weird that there was this room that, it wasn't in the schematic or the blueprints to the house, but it was there, and there was this weird, weird connotation to it. But and then it escalated, and then they started seeing things. They were starting to see apparitions. George was getting angrier and angrier, and then we get to the point where they know that something is going on. They called for ministers. It escalated very, very quickly, and it got to the point where, George, it's interesting because George would tell the story of what happened to him and Kathy the last night. But he would never speak for what happened to the boys the last night, and he said that's their story to tell, and when they're ready to tell it, they will tell it. But for him, the last night, he could hear the bedposts upstairs in the boys' room, jumping up and down, banging. And then he realized that he was paralyzed and that he couldn't move. Their dog Harry would stand up at the foot of the bed, spin around in a circle, throw up, lay down, stand up, spin around in a circle, throw up, and he just kept doing it. And he was paralyzed. He couldn't get up to help him. And at that point, Kathy had kind of changed form. She had kind of appeared as this old woman, but she also started to levitate up off the bed and to float away. And he said he could, in his mind's eye, see this black hooded figure rolling through the house. And he said at that point, he sat straight up in bed. He, in his own voice, yelled out, "It's in the boys' room," but at the same time created a second voice that came out of him that just let out this horrifying, deep guttural wail that he was never able to recreate. So he had two voices coming out of him at once. And at that point, they, in the movies and book, it always seems like they leave in the middle of the night and they leave forever. But they didn't even leave in the middle of the night. They actually left the next day. They stayed the rest of that night. And then,
how in the world do you stay through that?
Yeah, I have often wondered that. And when I would just look at him and I go, why? And he would just laugh. But he's like, it's something you'll never understand. And he basically explained it to me that it was their house and they didn't want to just give it up. And they and then that was the kind of the thing, is that they never intended to leave the house forever. They wanted to fix it. They wanted to stay.
So what happens then after they leave the next morning?
Well, they went to Kathy's mother's house. They contacted, several people to try and help get things going. Obviously, they contacted the Warrens. And the Warrens, they contacted Hans Holzer. They got to the point where, they were just trying to find somebody who could help them. Mm-hmm. And finally, Ed and Lorraine Warren told them, there's really no fixing this house. There are a few items that you can take with you. But that's it. The rest of that stuff just needs to go. And so all of the stuff that was in that house was eventually auctioned off.
Oh, wow.
So some of these objects, like there was a lion statue, this freaky looking thing. Kathy had given it to George as an anniversary present. And it really truly was hideous. And so I'm like, nothing says love like scary lion statue. And so he would say that, it would move around the house, and he was blaming the kids, and the kids were like, no, we hate that thing. We're not going to touch it. And one night he went downstairs after hearing the front door slamming, and it was pitch dark. He walks downstairs. He felt a bite on the back of his ankle, and he turned on the light, and the lion statue was standing right where he had been bit, and he had teeth marks in his ankle in the exact shape of the lion's mouth. So he threw it out in the trash, and it went away in the garbage truck, but the next day was back in the house.
Huh.
So that lion statue actually eventually was sold in an auction, so it's still out there.
Oh, man. Well, okay, so obviously a concrete statue didn't really follow him through the house and bite him. I mean, do you think this force or whatever is in this house is just imitating these things?
I don't know. I assume so, because he did physically throw it out in the trash. So that's the story that he told. So it's hard to say now. Do I think that, it manifested, in that lion's shape to, mess with his head? Yeah, probably. That's what happened.
Yeah.
We interrupt our program to bring you this important message.
Hey, it's Michael. You guys are listening to the Paranormal Patio on the Hair-Raising Horror Week. Stay tuned for some more scary stuff.
In a sleepy little town in southwest Minnesota lies a house where the inhabitants are not of this world, the Boyd House. Some disturbing behaviors include audible voices and EVPs, equipment interaction, and moving objects. Now, for the first time ever, a documentary has been made. Join us as we watch the town and house in the days gone by. Exclusive interviews with investigators as they share their experiences and evidence from their nights at the Boyd House. Check out our Facebook page, Boyd House, or on YouTube on our St. Croix Paranormal page to view this spooky adventure.
So, Warrens come in, and they have a reputation, of the hyper-religious, everything's a demon. Do you think if someone else would have came in, the story would have went differently from that point?
Obviously, Hans Holzer had very different ideas about what it was. He believed it was Native American in nature.
Okay, fair.
So, yeah, yes, obviously, I think that there could be, but I know that whatever it was nasty enough, whether it be Native American or demonic, whatever it was nasty enough to continue to follow him until the day he died. I have had stuff happen to me directly related to that case. Anytime to be quite honest, something is probably going to happen here tonight, and it happens every time I do something like this. Sometimes it's really, really small, and it's just like something knocking on the door, but there's nothing there. My wife didn't believe in the paranormal at all, like did not believe into it. But I did. She came to one of my college lectures about Amityville, and that night we got home. We have this, it's a cast iron, like it's a very, very heavy. It's like 3 feet long leaf sculpture, I guess, and it hangs on the wall. It doesn't move, and if it does move, it would just drop to the ground. That night after I talked about it, we heard this horrible crash. And came out, and it was not dropped on the ground in front of where it hangs, but was thrown across the room next to our fridge, which is, I guess, about 12 feet.
Wow.
And at that point, she was, she's like, okay, well, maybe there is something to this.
So does this stuff always happen to you following you talking about it, or do I need to be on guard here?
Good luck.
I appreciate the vote of confidence.
I've never had anybody who's performed the interviews have anything happen after. I have had stuff happen to them during.
Okay.
Normally it just tries to stop me. Like I was telling you before the show started, I was like, we were able to technical difficulties follow this thing around. The summer that I was really actively speaking at engagements about Amityville, I had an issue with this. First, it appeared as a small Chinese or Asian girl, and that would just stand in the corner of the room and cry. And this was back in this was early MySpace days, and so I would see her, and then I would, at first it was just kind of peripherally, and I would look, and then she would vanish. But then she would stay a little bit longer. And then one day, she stopped coming, and there was a little boy who had this disfigured face. And he was in the corner of the room, and, I was trying to pretend that I didn't see it, but I did definitely see it. And then I finally looked straight towards him, and he said one thing, and he said, if you don't do what you're supposed to, this is what's going to happen to me. Then vanished. 10 minutes later, he appeared directly in the center of the room. And then all of a sudden, he ran straight at my bed. And when he got to my bed, he vanished. I let out the least manly, high-pitched, wailing scream and almost threw myself out of my bedroom window. I'm terrified. And then all of a sudden, I look down, and my cell phone is ringing. And this is, 2 or 3 o'clock in the morning, and I look down, and it is my house phone calling my cell phone. And I know at the time was living with my, 85-year-old grandmother, who definitely was in bed and definitely would not be calling me on my cell at that hour. So I foolishly answered the phone. I went, hello? And it was George Lutz's answering machine coming through my grandmother's, our home phone. And George Lutz had been dead probably a year or two at that point. And they didn't even have that voicemail message on their answering machine anymore. So,
oh, man.
And so that's the kind of thing that would happen to me. My blankets ripped off me in the middle of the night. One time I was speaking at an event in Bethlehem, Pennsylvania, and I was taking a shower, and I got out, and I was getting ready to go back to the event to do how paranormal conventions is always the nighttime party stuff.
Sure.
So I was getting ready to go back down to the party, and my bathroom just started screaming this vicious, horrible scream, and I'm terrified. And I had given the Amityville talk that day. So anytime I talk about him being in the right and that this is what really happened to them, these are the things that were going on, I do have repercussions.
Well, at the risk of putting you in harm's way, we got to get back to what happens after they leave the house.
Well, at that point, they moved. Then, they continue to have, phenomenon happen. And George never talked about that very much. He just said, it got to be that point. They did the book and the movies, people started, doubting what was going on with them, but they were still having stuff happen. And it just got to a point where George is like, I can't do this anymore. So he stepped out of the public eye for, 30 years. And then he decided towards the end that it was time for him to get back out there and start helping people who were experiencing very similar things. So he kind of turned this into a vehicle for him to help other people. And that's kind of where I came back into, or where I come into the stories. I traveled with him and, I went with him on cases where he helped people.
So in the time that he had stepped out of the public eye, did the paranormal activity slow down for him, or was he dealing with it the entire time?
He was dealing with it the entire time. This is something I'm not sure if I've ever talked about this publicly before, but he slept with a rosary, clenched in his hand, and he would sleep in the center of the bed. He always had to have the TV on. It always had to be something lighthearted and a comedy. In fact, it was one of the things that he taught me to use if things started being like really dark and oppressive with this stuff. He's like, they hate it, laughter. They do not understand laughter. Use that. They don't understand that whole happy, loving feeling. So he would sleep in this with this rosary in the center of the bed, and nobody was going to see that. We would go in, he would be taking a nap like that, just getting, he would have no idea we were going to come in and get, camera equipment or whatever. Mm-hmm. He would just be that way. So that was the way he was living. We were, another case in point, another story that, I have told this one before, but, we were at a Walmart, and George, because as I said, hated the Ryan Reynolds movie. Mm-hmm. So both George and I's good friend, Tim Yancey, wanted George to sign a copy of the Ryan Reynolds movie. So he had this, the only copy of anything of the Ryan Reynolds movie that was signed by George Lutz. So that was something George is like, fine, for you, I will do that one thing. Hmm. So Tim went and bought the movie at Walmart, and we were checking out, and I was standing behind Tim. George is, standing in front of Tim, and she, the cashier's talking to us very normally. She scans the movie, it doesn't scan. So she does, she's very calm at first, and then all of a sudden she starts scanning it with the gun repeatedly, and then she starts banging the movie on the desk, and you can see something is going on, and she completely melts down. She starts slamming the movie and screaming, "This is a horrible movie!" And to the point that the manager comes over and he's like, "What is happening?" And Tim and I are completely freaked out, and George didn't even react, because he's like, I wish I could say that's the first time I've seen something like that happen. And so and that was the kind of, I was terrified. And so that's the kind of stuff that he said happened to them always.
Wow. To live a life with that being the norm, I can't imagine that even, watching The Hangover on repeat would be enough to laugh out of it. I mean, it goes to his character that he's able to maintain any sort of normalcy at all in his life.
Yeah, I've often wondered, how do you, because I know that even just what little I have dealt with, I think that, it changed me in profound ways. I mean, so I can't imagine dealing with, 4 decades of this mess.
It's insane to think about. I mean, and then at the end of the day, living that life, he makes a decision to help other people.
Yep.
I mean, that's character,
Well, and it's weird because he would hang around after the events, even long after, there were always those who were there because they were, starstruck by, the horror chasers who, wanted to be, touch a piece of the stardom of this horror movie. And he always would hang around and he would be scanning them. And I had seen him doing this, and I asked him about it one time. I'm like, what are you doing when you're looking around at these people? And he's like, I'm looking for the ones I know want to talk to me, but don't know how to tell me. And I look for them so that I can go to them and start the conversation.
We need more people like that in the world right now, I think.
I agree with that. When he passed, it was a tremendous loss. It was, not just for me, but for all the people that he helped. He was extremely funny. He was doing everything he could, to help. And, he just, it was very selfless in that way. And like I said, I was kind of a lost soul at the time. So like he kind of just, helped me get back on track and put me where I needed to be. And I've always appreciated him and thankful that like the opportunities I was given and had because of him stepping in and doing what he did for me. And, he did that for a lot of people. And he just really wanted to help, especially if there were houses or families that had children. He was very quick to help in those situations.
So while you're toting around the circuits with him, when did you start experiencing like problems with this case affecting your life?
After he died. And after he died, probably the second or third time I talked about Amityville publicly. And I started telling, his stories. And I actually can tell you the exact first time. We had shot video of him talking about his experience with the last night in the house. And I had always been very hesitant to show that video in my presentations, even though I had it. I don't know, it's very hard hitting and it's very raw emotionally to see this man telling you what he had happened to him in his own words and his own voice. So I'd always been very reluctant to show that video because it was very personal to me, and I was very reluctant at first to show that video. And then I decided that, I would do that. I would, after two or three times, I was going to make that call and I was going to show the video. And then I did. And as soon as I started showing that video, I started having stuff happen.
That's crazy. I'm sitting here and I'm digesting this, and you talked about how much of a prankster he was with you. Has it ever crossed your mind that maybe all this is just, him reaching through from the other side to prank you another time?
Oh, he does that. But he also makes it very clear when it's him.
Okay. Can you elaborate on that at all, or is that a little more personal?
At the time, I was typing on the computer, and then it just started typing his name repeatedly, and started opening ridiculous amounts of web pages, typing in his name, and then the last one, it opened up a porn site. And as I said, I was at the time living with my 80-year-old grandmother, who obviously didn't want me watching porn under her watch. So I know for sure that's the kind that's him. He did one time scare me. I was driving in a car. It was late at night, and he did appear briefly in the back seat, and I about shit my pants.
Yeah.
Oh, and then he disappeared when I, almost wrecked the car and turned around. So that was the only time that anything he did was scary. There's definitely a different vibe between what they do and what he does. Anywhere we would go, weird stuff would just happen. One time we were sitting outside a video store in North Carolina, and it was a bunch of us who had just done one of his events. And we were talking, and he was talking about, stuff that happened in the house. Some of it was stuff we've already talked about. I know one time he was telling the story about the last night and the flies, and, how the flies were, so crazy. And as we were watching, as he starts to get to the part about being there the last night, his, the shape of his head started changing, and, it elongated, and, I looked at it, I'm like, is this the light? What am I seeing? And, I kept looking, I'm like, this can't be, but I'm pretty sure I'm seeing it. And then I, looked around to see if anybody else was reacting to it, and, several other people were. So I was like, what the hell? That's the kind of stuff that, just these weird little tidbits that happened all the time.
Hey gang, I'm Lonnie Scott, host of Weird Web Radio, and you're listening to Hair-Raising Horror Week. Stay weird out there, my friends.
Looking back on all of it from your experience with him, what do you think happened? What do you think the story is?
I go back and forth about what I think. There's heavy speculation, that he was into some heavy occult stuff. Both his, stepsons have said it. Other people have said it. Other people in the town have said, they saw him, visiting the occult shops. He has blatantly said he was into transcendental meditation. So I think that, maybe, I guess, looking back and, and everything I've heard and seen, I think that maybe he got involved into something that was more than he could handle. And it let him know that it was more than he could handle. And, he obviously got a fame and a notoriety and, some monetary compensation for this story. But with all of that came severe prices. And I think that at the end of the day, maybe that's what happened, that, there was something that he did that pushed things to a dark place that he was not quite ready or understood what was coming. I remember one time he actually said that of all the people I've dealt with in the paranormal, as much as Ed and Lorraine Warren knew about paranormal phenomenon, they really themselves were just babes in the woods for understanding it. And so to me, to say that, arguably at the time, they were considered to be, the foremost authorities on this stuff. But for him to say, they knew very little about all this stuff, even though they knew a lot, in comparison to an average person, that they really, really themselves still didn't understand what all of this was.
Do you think that came from his experience in the occult, or do you think it's some sort of intuition that he knew what he had and they didn't? I mean, where do you think that statement comes from?
I think it comes from a little bit of that. I think it comes from experiencing this stuff on a different level than the Warrens did. I think it comes from, obviously, I think it does come from practicing the occult and knowing, what he did that caused all of this chain reaction. So I think that there's a lot of building blocks that made up all of that.
Yeah. We'll change gears a little bit and we'll get a little less spooky. You had mentioned how much he absolutely hated the Ryan Reynolds movie.
Hated it.
Well, the Amityville story spawned, I don't even know how many movies, like 7?
Yeah, like that. Something like that.
I mean, I'm sure he hated all of them equally.
He said, like the first one with James Brolin, he said, he didn't hate that movie. He said there were things they got wrong and there were things that they took creative liberties with.
Sure.
But he said overall he didn't hate that movie. But they had a hand in that. He's like, everything after that, they didn't really have much of a hand in. And, MGM took a lot of, and these are his words, broke a lot of contracts, and did a lot of things that they weren't supposed to do. One of the things that bothered me so much about the Ryan Reynolds movie is that in the movie, he kills their dog. And, it didn't happen even remotely in real life, their dog Harry lived with them for like 12 years and like he died of old age, in California. So like he never killed them. He never tried to murder his family. He never built coffins to put them in the basement. All of these things, like there was no girl who, put the babysitter's finger in a bullet hole in her head, like none, and like those kinds of things, like that really just irked him. He's like, because they had so much information about the actual case that were 10 times more frightening than anything that they put in those movies. And they just, went more of trying to paint him as this abusive father. And I think given that he was gruff, I think that some of that struck a chord with him. because it was something he was trying to atone for. I think at least in the case of me and other people, like, that he had taken under his wing, like he was trying to atone for some of that stuff, and it was just ripping Band-Aids off wounds.
Sure. From a personal standpoint, how do you feel about the series of movies? Just as a movie watching fan, not as someone.
Okay, if I take myself away from knowing what happened, I don't detest the movie, especially the first one was it's a horror classic. It's absolutely a horror classic. So, when we get to like Amityville 3D, I hate them.
They're pretty bad. The second one, despite all of its shortcomings, and it is a bad movie, has earned a place in my heart as being one of my favorite horror movies. It's ridiculous and poorly acted and poorly written, and the last third seems to basically just be an Exorcist ripoff. But I love that movie so much, and I can't really explain why.
We all have those movies.
It runs the gamut on everything, incest and possession, and it's terrifically bad.
Yeah. It's been a long time since I've seen it. Some of them I never saw the 3D one in its entirety. I just couldn't do it. And then the Ryan Reynolds movie, like, at the time I was already connected to the case, so like, I watched it going, if this movie keeps having sequels, eventually I will show up as a character. So.
Wouldn't that be something?
Yeah. The guy was like, oh, this is okay, because eventually I will show up as a character here. But I never did, because obviously they never made more than the one.
You mentioned about the contents of the house being auctioned off and stuff. I think there was one of the movies later on was like a clock or a mirror or something that somebody had bought. Yeah. Was that Amityville 92? It's About Time?
Yeah, I think so.
And it's because it's a clock and it's about time. It has nothing to do with anything.
Yeah, it's not even really tied to the house, other than that's where the clock came from.
It's such an easy way to churn out these terrible movies.
Yeah, and that's kind of his, it was his beef with all of it.
Understandable. Are you aware of any stories from any of the things that have been auctioned off? Like people that have come out and said, hey, something's going on with this bureau that I bought?
Well, the planks from the house that Greg and Dana Newkirk have in the Traveling Museum of the Paranormal and Occult and Paranormal, they have stuff happen with those. Humming, weird stuff happening with those, and they have them in their collection. So there are, tales from Greg and I actually started ghost hunting together years ago. And so, he and I have, kept in touch, and he knows my connection. In fact, I gave him George Lutch's watch that he gave me when he passed away for the museum. So, and the watch never, like, per se did weird stuff. It was dead for, like, right after. When he gave it to me, it did not work. But, like, sometimes it would randomly, like, sputter to life and start spinning backwards for, like, 10 minutes. And Greg had seen that happen, with it. But, like, the planks that were, originally from, the initial remodeling in the house, he's had stuff happen with them. But other than that, that's the only stories I've heard of objects turning up from the house. I actively looked for that lion statue for a very long time, but I've never been able to find it.
Oh, it's lost in time, I'm sure.
There was always this, like, little chance it was the one from the house.
Maybe you need to just buy an unrelated one just as some sort of, token to the story.
Yeah, well, although if I actually find one of the replicas, my wife will make it very clear it can't stay, so.
Put it in the boathouse.
Yep. Smart is the shed.
Well, you work with what you've got.
Yeah, exactly.
Just dig a ditch. It's almost the same. So, I know you touched on your violent attack, and being a part of Hair Raising Horror Week here on the Paranormal Patio, do you have any other unrelated stories that you'd like to share that are guaranteed to get under everybody's skin and keep them up at night?
I accidentally, well, it wasn't, I was making a joke, and Greg and Dana had this little statue, that, had some, nastiness attached to it. They called it the crone. And I had, during one of their live video feeds of the artifacts in their museum, had made, comments about, making our son a sacrifice. And I was saying it jokingly, but I forget that, God and Artifact doesn't care if I'm joking. And, right after, that happened, I started, my wife and I could hear running around upstairs in our house, and I was like, the cat is right there. What is that? What is that? And so I started to go into the kitchen, and there were wet spots all over the floor. And I'm like, why is there water over here? And I looked at them, and I turned on the light, and I looked, and they were footprint shapes, like something wet had walked through the house. And I went, and I followed them, and they went to our door where we've been inside for several hours. And I was like, wait, where are these going? So I followed them, and then I realized that they were going up our stairs. So I called Greg and Dana, and I was like, what do you make of this? And they're like, that the crone makes stuff like that happen. Wet footprint is kind of her MO. And they're like, you made a joke about sacrificing your child. Have you gone upstairs to his room? And I was like, no, and I don't really want to right now. But I was like, okay, well, I'll go check it out. We need to make sure, everything's cool. Our son actually wasn't home at the time. He was, staying overnight at a grandparent's house, but I followed the water upstairs, and it went into his room, and directly in front of his crib was a large puddle of water.
Oh, no.
And at that point, I was like, oh, what have I done? So the first night, he was home. After that, it was the middle of the night. We were in bed, and all of a sudden the lights started flashing, and I heard all of our Amazon Echo say, okay, I can do that for you right now, or something to that effect. And all of them said it at once.
Oh, man.
And the lights flashed on, flashed off, and then I hear my son blood-curdling scream from his room. I run up the stairs. I throw open the door. He is screaming. He's pointing to the corner. I look, and the way that Greg and Dana had described the crone was standing. She looked, kind of like the girl from The Ring, in the corner, and she let out this horrible wail and then disappeared. And at that point, Greg and Dana and I did a cleanup here.
Oh, man.
So that's, the kind of stuff that I've accidentally done here at my home.
I can see why your wife is so against you getting into this stuff nowadays.
Well, I for a long time was doing, 3D scanning of the Newkirk's objects, and we would, see what would happen with the 3D prints of them afterwards. And sometimes they would actually have stuff happen with them that showed traits of the original parent. So, the original parent object, which was a really interesting study. And I still have a few of them here in the house, but they've thankfully calmed down.
My goodness. Jason, thank you so much for coming on the show and sharing some really interesting stuff. The George that you knew just sounded like an awesome guy.
I was very fortunate, and I can't say enough that who he was when I knew him was just a stand-up, wonderful guy.
All right, well, I'm going to let you go. I cut you loose. Once again, thank you so much for coming on the show.
I hope that it gave you some of what you were looking for, or at least was interesting.
Absolutely, 100% interesting. You possess a story that very few people actually know. So, thanks for sharing it, man.
No problem, anytime.
All right. Well, you've been listening to Paranormal Patio, Hair Raising Horror Week. I'm Jason, my guest Jason. Thank you for stopping in, and thank everybody at home for having a listen. Hopefully, we keep you up tonight. That's the goal.
Take care, guys.
Hey everybody, this is Christian.
My name is Dustin.
And you're listening to Paranormal Patio
during Hair-Raising Horror Week.
Until next time, keep the fire going.